I want to wish you a happy Mother's Day. We're really excited to have Paul DeLong with us today. So Paul, first and foremost, to me, is a really great neighbor on our street. He and Abby, who's in the back row there, lived on our street before we moved there, and they've been one of our really great neighbors. And living in Madison, you begin to realize that there's really amazing people that live in our neighborhoods. And when we're thinking about topics for our adult ed, I really thought of Paul as an excellent one. So Paul actually did his forestry school training here at UW-Stevens Point in Wisconsin. And then he served in the DNR for more than 20 years in various leadership positions. He was state forester for part of that time. And then I believe 2016, well, he also served as president of the National Association of State Foresters as well. And then he joined the American Forest Foundation, which was a foundation, I think it's based in DC. And fortunately, I think he was able to stay in Madison for most of that time, but he has worked at the national level. And then just recently in 2021, he joined here at UW Extension. So he has an office on campus, and he's associate dean for, I have to look this up, policy, operations, and engagement, overseeing the administrative and outreach aspects of Extension organization. And certainly Extension is an incredibly important part of our university. And I want to thank Paul for all the various levels of service that he's done over the years. So he's very knowledgeable about forests and still passionate about that. And so I think he'll be really an excellent hour that we'll look forward to. And I encourage you to jump in with questions as well.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. Speaking of good neighbors, I feel like I should say State Farm is there, but I'm not going to. Okay, I think I just did. All right, so it's a great opportunity to be here with you this morning to talk about forests. I'm passionate about forests and communicating some of what makes our forests in Wisconsin really awesome. So how many of you, when you think of Wisconsin, you immediately think of forests? Okay, somebody's like, well, yeah, but I really think of cheese, right? Cheese, brats, beer, cows, right? Right. Did you know we have more forest land than agricultural land in this state? Get out of here, you're saying. Do you want to fact check me on this? No, it's true. It is true. We have actually more forest land than agricultural land in Wisconsin. So let's take a trip through our forests. And I subtitled this, The Only Constant is Change, because when we think of forests, we also tend to think of them in a static way. Unlike agricultural land, if you're like driving to Baraboo, right, and you're on Highway 12 and you watch the seasons, right, you have the bare land and the crops come up and then they get harvested. There's the rolls of hay. I used to say hay bales. What are they still called bales? Those big rolls, whatever they are, right? And we have this sense of seasonality. We look at our forest and we're like, yep, forest is there. Oh, colors of leaves changed, but otherwise the forest is there. But those forests are also always changing. So we're going to talk about change in forests at a grand scale, and then talk about what that means in terms of going forward. So let's dive in. And yes, you can ask questions. John, I guess he said he forced me. He said you have to take questions. Under some pressure and duress, I decided, okay, fine. So you can feel free to interrupt, or we'll have some time at the end to dive into questions in more detail. But let's look back first, okay? So this is a map of Wisconsin showing land cover in the 1830s that was done by the General Land Office. Finley, University of Wisconsin, very famous dude, I think is the official term they use on campus, came up with this. And what this shows is up here you see the forests. This is all forest land down in here. This is forest land. And then you start to move into what are savannas, and then the yellow is prairie. Okay, about 86% of Wisconsin was forested before large-scale European settlement. Now, these prairies and savannas down here were only the way they were because of human influence. What was that human influence? not actually fire suppression. It's actually the opposite. It was actually the use of fire by whom? Native Americans. So the tribes of Wisconsin were actively managing our lands and forests long before European settlement. And that gets to one of the things we think of in terms of, oh, we Europeans came in and then we started doing stuff, when of course for millennia previously, the land had been managed. And in fact, when you look at the amount of precipitation Wisconsin gets, our landscapes desperately want to go to trees. Okay, and the only way to prevent them going to trees is to do disturbance that keeps trees back. And so fire is one of those ways in which that's done. All right, so this was our land cover in the state. But then we entered an era right before the Civil War, and then it really picked up in a significant way after the Civil War, where the standing trees in the state were an incredible asset. And so they were harvested at a very large scale. First, the conifers, the pines in particular, and then they came back for the hardwoods. Okay, what were these trees used for? Buildings. Yes, the cities of the Midwest were built with Wisconsin wood, not exclusively Wisconsin wood, but in 1899, Wisconsin not only led the country in wood production, it actually produced more wood than any country in the world in that year. So we were pulling our trees out of the forest at a rapid rate, first using our rivers to send them down to the mills, and then narrow gauge railroads came in, and that got access to additional forest, to the point at which almost all the forests of the state in a relatively short period of time had been harvested. But there's another thing going on about not what we use the material for, but why was it such an aggressive approach to harvesting our trees in the state? Agriculture, that's exactly right. The future was viewed as farming, that the state as a whole the economy was going to be based on farming. And so there was a huge promotion of the fact that the trees were viewed as a barrier to getting the land into a productive use. So we didn't view forests at the time as an asset. They were viewed in a sense as a liability. And so a lot of work went on to clear the land so that it could be farmed. However, something else happened in that time frame, which is the fact that when you cut trees and you leave the tops of the trees and you're doing it at a massive scale and that dries out, you end up with fires. Anyone maybe seen this picture before? You know what fire this represents? The Peshtigo fire. So in October of 1871, the United States' most destructive wildfire occurred in Wisconsin, the Peshtigo fire, burning 1.5 million acres and killing more than 1,200 people. And yes, we can still be bitter about the fact that the Chicago fire of the same day gets all the credit, gets all the news. It took days for all the ramifications of this to reach and to be fully understood. So what was the cause of these fires? It was these fires, by the way. It all kind of merged together in a kind of unique wind event. But it was agricultural burning that was likely, and potentially some railroad related fires that all came together to cause this blaze. But it wasn't the only one. There's a major fire in Phillips in 1894, for example, that killed a lot of people, burned a huge amount of acreage, and there's many others like that. So, but fire was viewed as dangerous as it related to huge wildfires, but fire was used by settlers to clear lands, to burn stumps as they tried to get the land ready to farm it. Okay, so this is all part of the process. So what you had then is you ended up with stump fields with then new owners, and this is high level of immigration was going on at the time. And the thing is, come to Wisconsin, head north, get your plot of land. You can grow these incredible array of vegetables. This is a marketing, by the way, photo to attract people to come to the north. And the reality is, in many parts of our state, the soils are not conducive to agriculture, nor is the climate for row crop agriculture of the day in particular. All right, so as a result, you had a huge amount of farm failures. And by the time we got into the Depression, a huge chunk of the land that had been cleared and farmed was left fallow and abandoned and went back to the municipalities on the tax for tax purposes. So this effort proved not to be accurate. What's important to think about, though, is this was done in a really legitimate, earnest effort, including the University of Wisconsin and the School of Agriculture at the time, promoting agriculture as the future. And it wasn't fully understood why that chunks of this state were not really conducive to agriculture. And so as a result, an important lesson for us to learn going forward of what is it that we know and understand, and what is it that we think we know, but we're not quite sure about, and how do we have our choices informed with the best available information going forward. All right, so there was enough concern going on in the state that the legislature passed and created a board of forestry, who then hired our first state forester, a man named E.M. Griffith, back in 1904. Now, what's interesting about this time period is there were very few professional foresters in the United States at the time, a very small number. This is like an expert in artificial intelligence 10 years ago, a curiosity, right? Who are these people? What do they do? Because forestry wasn't viewed as a profession. The idea that you would actually do thoughtful scientific management of forests, again, they were a barrier. They were something to be removed. So this was part of this transition to recognizing and starting to value forests. So E.M. Griffith came in, and to show you the politics is not a new phenomenon we have in this state. There were strong agricultural interests who did not like the fact that we had this person who was advocating and trying to do education around forests and their value, who was trying to replant forests across the state. No one really argued about the fire control part. And wanted to establish actual state forests, publicly managed forest lands. And so they worked hard, and long political story. The Supreme Court ruled in 1915 that a constitutional amendment passed in 1910 that allowed forestry to be undertaken by the state, which, by the way, was only illegal because of it was considered a work of internal improvement, which had to do with canals. So the Northwest Ordinance prohibited works of internal improvement because of the bankruptcy of canals out east. And so when the Wisconsin adopted its constitution, it kept that language. And so there was a debate about whether the state could be engaged in forestry or whether that would be considered internal improvement. Well, the people of the state decided in 1910, overwhelmingly voted to change the constitution so that forestry was legal. Isn't this exciting? I kind of worked in an illegal profession. Wow. And, but it wasn't read correctly in the second or third reading in the legislature, and therefore it was, the Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that it had to be thrown out in 1915. And so E.M. Griffith, fed up, left the state and never returned. It set back our forestry programs a decade until the Constitution was re-amended in 1926. And now forestry, I'm happy to tell you, remains legal in this state. Okay. All right. So moving forward. So what we had in the early 20th century was a cutover landscape, and where now it is transitioned to today, where we have forests again in a significant chunk of the state. Bless you. This is nothing to sneeze at, however, because to go from this to this took a lot of hard work. All right. So let's break it down a little bit more. So in the mid 1800s, you had these forests, but the issue is, okay, in the 1930s, we still had a lot of forestry. What's that about? But when you see these forests, the huge difference here was you had a lot of mature forests of diverse age classes, sizes, et cetera. This was a young, regrowing forest. Okay. And then what you see now moving forward is, and we'll see some statistics on this, I know you love statistics, right, is these forests are continuing to age, grow, diversify, and you'll start to see a recapture too of forest land here. Significant change here though is this savanna, this tan color, savanna and the yellow of prairie, largely turned to agriculture and remains in agriculture to this day. Except you notice areas, this is like the hills, the driftless area that now forests have recaptured. All right, so here's our stats. Almost half the state is forested. 17 million acres of forest land in Wisconsin. And there's chats apparently going on about our forests. Okay. And you see these are common species types or forest types that we talk about. And these have changed over time, and I want to get into that just a little bit. Sorry, this is a really difficult graph. The oldest data, all right, is on the bottom of each of these, so the blue. And then whatever that color is on the top is the most recent data. And what you'll see is that back in 1930s, aspen and birch were overwhelmingly the majority of our forests. The largest percentage rather of our forest was in aspen and birch. And watch how that's declined dramatically till today. And what you see are the Maple Beech birch forest, we often call it northern hardwood forest, and then the oak hickory forests have increased. And what that represents is the fact that, again, forests are always changing. So after the fires and the failed farms, you had these pioneer species coming in. So aspen, quaking aspen, big tooth aspen, and paper birch capture sites. They need disturbance and they need sunlight. So they capture, they don't tend to live very long. And then if they aren't disturbed, you have trees coming in underneath them. And so suddenly the oaks, the maples, et cetera, take over. And if there's a disturbance, the aspen and birch come back. Without disturbance, you see that succession, we call it in forestry. All right. So our forests, again, continue to change. So who owns our forests in Wisconsin? Well, as you can see, the majority of our forests are owned by individuals and families. Okay. Again, people think of forests, they think of, oh, those are publicly owned things. Well, in some places like out west, a very high percentage of public owned forests. But in Wisconsin, we have some publicly owned forests. You have the national forests in green, the lighter green and state forests, which are really hard to see. And then our largest public ownership is actually by the counties that have 2.4 million acres of forest land in a county forest system. The reason the counties own more is the fact that the tax delinquent land in our state went back to the county. It did not go to the state. Okay. And so where a lot of states establish state forest programs, and we do have one in this state, a bigger chunk of our forest lands ended up being managed by and owned by the counties. All right. So we're going to come again. This is really significant when you think the majority of our forests are owned. So when you think about the challenges I'm going to talk about, and how do we address challenges when so many different people own little segments of the forest? And that's getting more difficult. So just in a relatively brief period of time, what you'll see is the fact that the number of individual owners of forest land in the state continues to go up, which also means that the average size of a parcel continues to go down. So again, a challenge associated with when you get to issues like invasive species, you now have lots of little plots owned by different people, and you've got an invasive insect, for example, that doesn't care about ownership lines. And so if one person's trying to take care of it, or if you got a plant like buckthorn that's spreading, you're taking care of it, but your neighbor's not, you're going to get your buckthorn back, right? So that just creates challenges. And what this shows is, by the way, we used to have a lot of industrial owned forest land, the paper companies, Consolidated Paper, Georgia Pacific, Midwest Vaco, et cetera. And those have largely been sold off now. And so again, they're now, chunks of them are managed by timber investment management organizations and real estate investment trusts, but other chunks were sold off, more prime pieces that are now in smaller ownerships. So again, creates more of a challenge with respect to managing for issues. Finally, as noted, our forests are getting older. So this is actually just since the 60s. If we had it going back to the 30s, you would see even more dramatically how back in the 30s, you would have seen the vast majority would have been really young. Okay, forests, even by the 60s here, you see how relatively young forests were the majority or the largest single age class. And now how the purple line is more recent, how it keeps moving so that such that the now most dominant class is 61 to 80 years old. And you see this increase in the older forest land, and that's continuing to occur as our forests really still recover from something that happened more than a century ago. Forests are long-term. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the issues of thinking as we transition to going forward, how we think about our forests. And so we talk about forest conservation. So we move from forest as an impediment to forest as an asset. So how do then we assure that forests are able to provide that suite of benefits for us going forward? And we do that in the context of conservation. All right, Elda Leopold, a great Wisconsinite, a forestry grad in one of the earliest classes at the Yale School of Forestry, went out west, observed lots of things, came to Wisconsin to work for the Forest Products Laboratory, and then transitioned to the University of Wisconsin, where he founded the discipline of wildlife management, but he's trained as a forester. Again, managing wildlife is about managing the forest. Okay, so, all right. So we're going to talk about forest values. we often break them up into three groupings: social, ecological, and economic values. All right. So what do we mean by social values? Well, one of the biggest ways we think about it is like recreation. How many of you ever recreated in a forest? Okay, so forest users. Now, depending on what kind of recreation you do, if you're a silent sport person, you like to hike or you're kayaking and whatnot, and then you come across ATVs or snowmobiles, it might be, ooh, that's a little disruptive to me. Well, if you're a snowmobiler and the trail's closed because it's now used for, so what we're getting at here is the issue of demands on our forest. And I'm going to come back to that. But another way social is really important is trees within our community. How many think Madison would be a better place if we just got rid of the trees, no more leaf raking in the fall, you know, all the catkins and other seeds and the pollen this time of year? Would you prefer it? Would it just be better if we just cleared them out? No, huge asset, right? And that enhances the quality of our communities. All right, ecological values. Forests purify our air. Forests purify our water. Aren't they amazing? Just to stop there. Wow. Okay. And of course, they provide habitat for a whole array of species. And that is part of the forest, the fact that forests are not just different in terms of individual species, but the difference in size, magnitude, extent, combinations create a whole array of conditions that are attractive to different species. So for example, by the way, silviculture is the practice of managing forests to achieve an outcome. For a long time, silviculture was viewed as the way you maximize timber production, and silviculture remains to be used where you can figure out how to manage the forest for valuable timber products. But you can manage it for birds, you can manage forests for aesthetics, you can manage it for any number of values. And what foresters often are doing is looking at the combination of how do you manage forests so they can produce a range of values, from products to habitat for birds. And all I want you to take out of this is to say, how you choose to manage that forest then attracts different types of birds. And so that's just an example of the way in which we think about forest conditions. And because we've removed some natural disturbances like wildfire, we try to remove for reasons that may be pretty clear. We then try to mimic those disturbances as a way of creating the same habitat conditions. All right, economic. Wisconsin has a very robust forest products industry, and these numbers are probably not quite accurate anymore. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but let's just say we have a lot of individual forest products companies, and they support a lot of jobs. The last data I saw, 28 Wisconsin counties, forestry and forest-related jobs are in the top 3 employers in the county. So it's very important to the state. And Wisconsin has a long tenure of leading the nation in production of paper and paper products. So one of the things that's counterintuitive to a lot of people is the fact that when I was state forester and engaged with state foresters from other states, one of the things I grew to be increasingly appreciative of is Wisconsin's robust and diverse forest products industry was such an incredible asset that enabled us to keep forests in forests and to manage those forests for the identified priority needs. Whereas those who lost their markets out west, for example, they have no one to remove material, and that increases the risk of bad wildfires, for example. Their forests are different than ours, but the point being they would beg for somebody. They now pay hundreds of millions of dollars to have people come in and remove or cut and chip on site and leave material that if it were in Wisconsin would be used for value-added processing. And so as an example of the connection between markets and the ability then to achieve the ecological conditions you want. And I could spend an hour on this topic. It is amazing the breadth of products that are produced from wood, okay? And we think of course, paper, furniture, look around here, you see wood products here, right? But then, of course, fuel, and there's been a lot of talk about biofuels. And by the way, wood has been used as a fuel for many, many millennia, right? But the transition to newer types of fuels that have a wood base, use of nanocellulose, the microscopic level fiber that is being used for and tested for a range of products that we're going to see coming forward. Fibers are used for clothing, for example. So it's in toothpaste, it's in ice cream. Anybody have ice cream recently? You're consuming a wood product. Okay, just saying. All right. So, and no, that's not why it's chewy. Okay. So that's a problem with your ice cream. So the question that most often comes up and the assertion might be, oh, are we harvesting more than we're growing? You know, and how do you think about that balance? Well, very happy to report that we continue to add growth to our forest far in excess of what we harvest from our forest. And that has been the case for a long, long time. So our forests continue to grow in extent and magnitude. All right, let's shift gears and talk about some challenges facing our forests. All right, the world is changing. Anybody want to argue that point? Okay, so let's get into a few ways that's happening. How does it impact forest recreation? Well, as mentioned before, right, we have a growing population, and we're actually losing some of the places people used to be able to recreate as some of our larger blocks of private lands got subdivided off and sold off. And so you're consolidating ever more people onto smaller places, and the types of recreation continue to expand. And so as a result, we see the challenge of managing conflicts across different recreational users. Wildfires. So we are not at risk of a Peshtigo fire anymore in the state, I'm happy to report, but we continue to have wildfires in the state. And a continuing challenge is people build in fire-prone landscapes that create a risk when we try to protect lives and property from wildfire. This is a photo from a Wisconsin wildfire back in 2005. It looks more like the Western US pictures you see, right? There was a wildfire of over 3,000 acres this year near Camp McCoy. So we do get these large scale wildfires on occasion, but a lot of great work has been done over decades to bring greater awareness to people. People still cause 98% of our wildfires in Wisconsin, by the way. And to reduce risk and help landowners, homeowners understand how they can help protect their properties from destruction by wildfire. So I've referenced a couple of times the land use challenges we face as we see blocks of forest land having been sort of carved up. Okay, and there's two types of carving. One is ownership carving, where you've got a block of land, and now instead of one owner, it's got 5 owners. And then you get the issue of people doing different things on their properties creates a way of breaking up forests as well. It can be neither, it's not necessarily good or bad. It depends on what's occurring, but nonetheless, it makes it harder because it's difficult to think of the forest in a more collective way. Invasive, exotic, non-native species. So whether you're thinking plants like garlic mustard, buckthorn, honeysuckle, okay, that are aggressive and take over woodlands. So they might be fine in your yard, but when they get onto woodlands, they replace native plants. And then our insects, whether it's spongy moth or Asian longhorn beetle, which fortunately is slow and doesn't move very fast and spread. So it's been able to be squashed so far. Squashed, I don't mean in a literal sense, or maybe I do. And then that one, the emerald ash borer. Penny for your thoughts. So emerald ash borer is a great example of the impact of globalization. So globalization's brought much more trade flow. And what happens is insects love to hitchhike on material like pallets, for example. And so emerald ash borer was found in 2003 in Detroit. I believe it came into the Detroit International Airport probably on some material years before they found it. And in a slow period of time, humans helped it spread all over. And so we found it in 2008 down here. And I saw it just was found in Vilas County now. So it continues to spread throughout the state. We have over 800 million, I think it's 800 million ash trees in Wisconsin. And this thing kills every tree it gets into. Now you can spend money. The good news is if you have ash on your property, there's a way you can treat your ash every 2 to 3 years to keep the emerald ash borer at bay. We can't do that with 800 million trees. So what that portends is the loss of some significant habitats. Black ash swamps are a critical ecosystem in the northern part of the state, and they are often the only tree species in those systems. What's going to replace it? What's the water level going to do when those trees are gone? These are questions. Black ash is also a very culturally important species for our native tribes in the state. that utilize black ash. And so there again is something that's culturally important that is at risk of being lost due to an invasive species. All right, climate. Do you think we should probably talk about how the climate's changing? So these two, by the way, are showing what's already happened. This is not projections. This is actual data from 1950 to 2018 on what's happened with December, January, February, in case you're wondering what GJF is, temperature, minimum temperature, average minimum temperature during those months. And look at how in the north, it's much more significant change even in the south. And this is a really interesting one. This is precipitation, okay? And it's summer precipitation. So June, July, August from that same time period. And you see an increase in precipitation in southern Wisconsin and a decrease in precipitation in the north. And both of those can cause stress, by the way, to our forests. But particularly here, we've seen increased stress on forests, particularly in our droughtier soils, caused by the reduction in summer precipitation. So what do things look like going forward? Well, this is talking about temperature means across the year in the state, again, projected to be continuing to rise. And this is getting at, interestingly, specifically winter temperatures where we're supposed to see a greater degree of change than in summer temperatures, which are higher winter temperatures. And I don't know, some of you might say, oh, thank goodness, I don't like those cold winters. Think about what that means in terms of snow cover, frozen ground conditions, which by the way, are really important for accessing forest land in the winter, and the nature of the kind of composition of our forests that will change given the fact that we have forests that are adapted to the conditions in which, they exist. And so we're looking at the fact that we're likely to see certain species migrate to the north. No, we're not going to see them flying overhead, but they're slowly going to migrate, and we might assist that migration as we have species that are at the southern end of their current range now moving north into Canada. And we're going to see species that we don't have here be moving into Wisconsin. So precipitation is another one. You'll see overall, you see just a modest increase in projected precipitation, but this is an interesting one. This is showing the days per 100 years with greater than 4 inches of precipitation, and see how it's meant. The projections are we're going to increase. We're going to see a lot more severe storms, which again, the cause of flooding and the impact and the cost with respect to flooding. Again, what does that mean for our forests? And those are some of the questions that we're looking at. Finally, one of really key thing that we're thinking about with respect to forests and climate is how do we help forests adapt? So we want to keep forests healthy, we want to keep them diverse, and then we want to look at ways in which we make decisions that help, because when you make a decision in a forest and take an action, those decisions often can be seen decades and even a century later. So that's one of the things that's humbling about being a forester, is you're making a decision about something that will be in a set of conditions a century further down the road that you really don't know what exactly they'll be. Wow, wild. Okay, so thinking a lot about how we help our forests remain resilient. So these are some of the examples of the conditions we expect to see, and why it's important for us to be thinking about both what we know and don't yet really know for sure that our forests are likely to face. But there's another aspect of forests and climate, and that is forests are an incredible carbon sink. Okay, so when we talk about trying to mitigate climate change impacts, now forests play a different role, which is the importance of forests as a climate solution. Okay, not the climate solution, but a contributor to a climate, to reducing carbon emissions, not emissions, but reducing the overall carbon equation. So we're going to talk about how that works. This is the carbon cycle. Not going to get into it, other than to say trees, okay, the whole carbon dioxide, oxygen out, right? So they then sequester or store carbon. Lots of below ground storage, but of course they're also storing, and all the biomass there is storing carbon. That is released ultimately when forests burn. That's a quick release. Or when they die, for example, and decompose, that slowly releases the carbon. And so when we think about ways forests can store carbon, we can increase the extent of forests. We can increase the rate of growth in forests, so they more rapidly sequester carbon. And we can also think about how we use forest products to replace more carbon intensive products. I'm going to mention that in a second here. So here's an example of that. This is a wooden skyscraper. The actual tallest wooden building in the United States is in Milwaukee, by the way. I think it's going to be eclipsed soon, probably. There's kind of a race for growing bigger buildings out of wood. Now, before you think, oh my gosh, light a match, this is going to be bad, right? Wood, this is called cross-laminated timber, CLT, and it's done by placing wood panels at opposite to each other, and you build up, and through a binding agent, you create material like this that is actually less prone to structural failure than steel. Because steel reaches a temperature, it holds, it collapses. It just reaches a point at which it just melts, basically, right? Wood in this configuration actually takes a longer period of time under the same heat conditions to actually lose its structural integrity. So it's very counterintuitive, but it's a really cool thing about wood. All right, so the ways in which we can replace some of what have been traditionally concrete and steel, heavy carbon utilizers, to something with wood, which is much less. Wisconsin is participating in a broader global effort called a trillion tree effort to try to increase the amount of trees that exist to try to sequester carbon. So this is some cool data about what Wisconsin's doing, and they're making some great progress on that. And I'm not going to pause on this other than to say, what's that pledge equate to? So it's, so the pledge will result in, over the next 50 years, sequestering a carbon equivalent that is produced by 6 million passenger vehicles over a year. 6 million, did I say billion? I meant million, okay. So private forests, again, let's loop back. Wait, most of our forests are owned by private individuals. How are we going to help them participate in this work? So most landowners harvest without a professional assistance. They just don't realize, again, it's like, oh, I have some trees. Someone wants to pay me for them. But that can make a real big difference. We've got some excellent loggers in the state, by the way, and I really, want to highlight that the vast majority of loggers do a really great job. But there are those who don't. And so getting a professional assistance of a forester becomes really important to help that landowner understand the consequence of the choices they make about what trees to cut, what to leave, how to maximize the values they see from those forests. This is the carbon connection. So what now we're seeing is where before carbon wasn't a product from the forest, it was like a given. Now suddenly carbon is a value. And so now landowners can also think about how can I manage my forest for an array of values, now one of which is carbon storage. And so we're seeing some programs being implemented now and others are in development to help look at how small landowners can participate in that sort of carbon economy. And it's another way to increase value that those forests provide to help incentivize landowners to keep their forests, keep it healthy, and in forestry in the long run. All right, I want to also talk about our forests in our communities. We talked a little bit about that before. Again, imagine taking all these trees out of Madison. How would we feel about it? Not great. But forests in our communities also are valuable in that they reduce energy costs. They reduce crime. There's a lot of really good research about how there's a correlation between tree canopy and crime rates, okay? Where more tree canopy, less crime. All right. So, and what we found is, of course, that traditionally we have greater canopy cover in our more affluent communities, less in our poorer communities. And there's a lot of great work going on to change that for all kinds of reasons. It's also, by the way, trees are correlated with health. Individual health is also correlated with tree canopy. Okay. So if you're feeling good today, please go hug a tree. And a mother, by the way, just to point that out, okay? At the same time is fine if you can work that out. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up here and take time, and then we're gonna open up to questions. But I've always loved this quote. Oh, and let me give a shout out. A lot of this data and information comes from the Department of Natural Resources and my former colleagues there. And a special shout out to Kirsten Held, who's actually here, who's our outreach specialist at DNR Forestry, who does an amazing job and was really helpful in this work. And she knows how much I love this slide. So not only do I love the quote, but I think when we think about forests, we do need to be like, it's really important to understand where we've come from as a way of then thinking about what does that tell us about how we should think about where we go from here. So understanding our history and what assumptions were made that got us to where we are, some good, some unfortunate, and then the recognition that there are things we know about what the future is going to hold, but how many of us know what the people of Wisconsin 100 years from now, what they're going to value from our forests? Do we know? Do we know what conditions they're going to be living in? I don't. And yet we're making decisions today with respect to forests that they will either benefit or not from. And so that's, again, very humbling, but I think the power of recognizing, oh, okay, we do need to learn from some of what we did and did not do with respect to our forests, because I think it can really help us take on and tackle challenges like the climate challenge. And you got to go back to Elder Leopold here. And because one of the things that he talks about here, and it's very interesting in the times we're in right now too, so we can never achieve harmony with land any more than we can achieve absolute justice or liberty for people. So he was suggesting in these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive. In other words, just because it's hard to find the absolute, like what does it mean to be in total harmony with land? Okay, we can debate that, by the way. We could have a really robust debate about what that looks like based on what we know today. And the point would be, let's not move forward because we're not sure or don't all agree on what the exact perfect relationship is. I think that's really important for us too. We can never know all that we'd like to know when we make decisions. So let's make the best decision as informed as possible. And we can hopefully look back and say we got more of them right than we got wrong. All right, so summary. The only constant is change, right? When you think about our forests and you drove by and say, boy, I didn't think that forest had been changing. The forest has been changing and it continues to change. So as we look ahead, let's make informed choices, okay? So that maybe we make sure that our forests continue to provide that full array of economic, ecological, and social benefits, not only for us today, but for future generations. That's what we in forestry call sustainable forestry, and that's what we strive to do. All right, so thank you very much for your time. We've got about a little over 15 minutes that I would welcome questions, comments, even random observations. Yes.
Let me bring it back over.
Okay, I guess I got two together in trees. The sugar maple in southwest Wisconsin, how is climate change going to affect that? And how is thousand canker going to affect to walnut as far as, is that moving in our area now or what's happening?
Okay, so two questions. Sugar maple. Yes, sugar maple is one of those that we're going to see pushing further north. It's going to become, it won't disappear, I don't believe. I haven't seen the latest information, but the last projections I had seen on it was sugar maple is going to continue to shift further to the north, and you're going to see it, but it won't be as competitive further south. Thousand canker, as if one canker is not enough, right? So thousand canker disease, which does affect black walnut. And black walnut is a very prized species. It, by the way, is an example of a species that is only in the southern part of the state. We are on the northern edge of walnut. So that's an example of walnut's actual habitat will shift further to the north now. And by the way, it will not disappear from southern Wisconsin because the bulk of walnut is actually to our south. Okay, so there's an example of walnut. So maple is going to retreat some, walnut, hickories, and oaks do well, by the way. Oaks are, yeah, we'll hold that question. Okay, so anyway, walnut, thousand canker. I have not heard that thousand cankers here. Kirsten, do you know? It's not here. Okay, that we know of. But we do recognize that it's likely to ultimately get here. So the work that goes on to assess how to mitigate the impact of thousand, how do you avoid its introduction? How do we prevent its spread? I can't give you the latest on that. I'm afraid I just don't know, but I know there's groups working on that. And it's another example of a challenge we face with respect to diseases.
Hi, question is, if you were going to plant 2 or 3 trees on your terrace in Madison, what species would you select?
Wow. So, if I may, piece of context. So we've learned, and I give City of Madison a lot of credit. Elms used to line the streets. How many of you were here when the elms lined the streets of Madison? Okay. And elm was selected all over the country because it was a perfect street tree. It took, it took the pounding, so to speak, and did well, had that umbrella shape. It was like a dream tree until Dutch elm disease basically took them out, right? There's actually 2 left on Bascom Hill. It used to be lined with elm trees, and there's 2 left now, and they're not long for us probably. So the bottom line is we said, oh, wow, that was a mistake. So what did we plant? The city planted lots of green and white ash, oops, and a lot of Norway maple actually. The ash now, emerald ash borer. So what the city is now doing is recognizing we need to diversify more. Okay, so now the trees they plant on the terraces, love that Wisconsin term, by the way, is that they are now looking at making sure that we have an array of different species. What I actually prefer, so this is a challenge because the terrace, you need a tree that's going to be really withstand the pounding that comes from the fact that you got concrete and asphalt and road salt and other things. Okay. So trees I like in the terrace. People aren't going to like what I'm going to say here. So I like Kentucky coffee tree. Okay. Yes, they are really not attractive when they're really young, but they will get attractive. Okay, trust me on that, please. Okay. I actually like one of the maples. And there's one called the Freeman maple. It's a fast grower. It's got nice fall color. It's actually a hybrid between our native maples. And I love maples. I just love the color of maples. So that's one I think is really cool. And they're now planting a fair amount of like swamp white oak, which seems odd, but it's actually, again, a pretty hardy tree. So you get an oak and that sort of stately nature of oaks, and then you get so I like the different forms there. So I love the honey locust from its look, but they're a kind of a mess. And so people don't tend to like those unless you're sure they're seedless as well. Yeah. Oh, and there's now planting plane trees, by the way, which I'm not sure which variety they are, which is a sycamore basically, which has a really cool bark orientation too. So key is to look and make sure that you get some different ones so that if one of them gets affected, you have others left.
So one of the things that we read about out west is that oversuppression of forest fires has been a real problem. Is that an issue in Wisconsin, or is that you didn't mention that explicitly as part of your presentation?
Yeah, so naturally in Wisconsin, there are forests and other habitats that we would want to burn. Okay, and we do burning. We burn prairies, we burn our savannas, for example. We will burn through oak forests. But we can't burn to the extent with the kind of development that occurs. It has become ever more challenging to do those burns. And the intensity of the burns that we sometimes would like, we can't get because it's too dangerous. So we do have the issue of what that results in is a change in the composition of our forest as a result. So this is where we can't really mimic nature to the full extent we might want to achieve the outcomes we need. So that's where work goes on to look at how you combine burning with tree removal, harvesting, for example, to create the kind of conditions, what you do with residual material. There's ways in which we try to create the conditions that can get the desired outcome we have. But there is definitely a change that has resulted by the fact that we don't allow natural fire anymore. We can't allow natural fire to do its thing, given the consequences it has on people and their property.
So with such a breaking up of the forest, so to speak, by these many populations, uh, what are we doing with education for the children and the adolescents and we senior people
Mm.
to begin to get an overall, if that's ever possible, understanding of the importance of being tuned in to this many faceted concern and need?
Mhm. Yeah, great question. And it's like Kirsten planted that question, by the way. Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done to create opportunities for people of all ages to get more exposure. Certainly a lot of focus on youth and the way in which we create opportunities for youth to get exposure to forests and a way of thinking about forests that is, I guess I'll say, more robust, which is helpful then in thinking about how we problem solve the challenges that we have. But it's hard. It's hard to get attention, for any period of time for any group of people. So we've got curriculum that is tied in. We've actually got a forestry curriculum that's tied into our K-12 learning objectives called the Learning and Educational Activities in Forestry. LEAF is what, yeah, I was trying to be, yeah. Anyway, so there's a great group out of UW-Stevens Point that is engaged in that work and helping teachers get access to materials like that. And then there's just lots of events that are done. There's an actual book on Wisconsin's forests for pre-K kids. And then we've got a elementary school oriented 4th grade reader book. And then we've done some work with adults as well. Again, trying to increase exposure and understanding to Wisconsin's forests. But that's an ongoing quest to increase awareness and understanding. Oh. So Into the Outdoors is a program produced and was shown on public television, and it's there's Wisconsin episodes on forests, and they're in the archives that you can find through public television or just Into the Outdoors itself. So if you Googled Into the Outdoors, you can find some episodes on forests there that have been really well produced.
I'm concerned about species that depend on forests for their survival. Basically, I'm very much interested in birds, but my concern is that there's a trend of some species declining pretty significantly, and we have to do a somewhat a better job of managing the forests in some other ways, specific areas, but. We're starting to do the right thing, but we still have to do more, I think.
Yeah, and bird species are interesting. I mean, as I mentioned, I showed that slide around the different habitats. So what we were finding actually, interestingly, was we had issues with respect to some species that really like closed canopy forests at a large extent scale. And we were also finding challenges with birds who need open young forests. As our forests started to age, we now then started to find that we were running into challenges. So Kirtland's warbler is a good example of a bird species that is adapted to droughty soil, sandy soil pine, often jack pine is our native pine. And as that, we had a lot of that habitat after the cutover burn, right? The jack pine loved it. And what happened is over time that started to decline as forests succeeded and wildfires were controlled. And that bird needs young pine. It also can live in red pine as well. And so what we saw was it was an endangered bird that needed more disturbance. And then we have birds that are struggling that need more larger, diverse canopy forests as well. We also, with birds, a lot of them are migratory, of course, and we look at their winter habitats in other places. And so that's also definitely contributing to some of the decline of songbirds is their winter habitat, which can be in South and Central America or the Southern US. So birds are hard because they are the ultimate mobile. They're the antithesis of trees, which don't move very well.
We have a question here from online. Ann Lundeen wants to know the effect of jumping worms on forests.
Jumping worms. So yes, so when you think of species that you're thinking of, oh my God, this is a threat to our forests, And then you end up with worms on the list, right? What? Okay, yes, even worms. So a jumping worm is a non-native worm. And again, worms and earthworms, by the way, the ones that you see and you love in your garden are actually bad for the forest. They're not native. We actually have no native earthworms in Wisconsin. The glacier sort of took care of those. So they've come over and we like them in that sense, but we have our forests are adapted to conditions such that what regeneration takes, worms disrupt that actually because of what the work they do in decomposition in the duff layer. So jumping worms is another example, and where there's been work going on, again, trying to limit the spread of them and then to look at, and I can't speak to actually the full effect of what jumping worms do in terms of the impact that they have, but it's just another example of a species that is going into a niche that it isn't part of, and it does its thing. And as a result, then it affects the ability of plants that are adapted to that system to be able to reproduce.
Okay, a couple of comments. To end on a positive note about some good things that have happened in Wisconsin. If you look at the amount of forest in private ownership, I think the Wisconsin Woodland Owners Association has had an impact. And the other is the importance of enlightened legislators who have enacted things like the Wisconsin Managed Forest Law. If you just say a couple words about those things.
Happy to, yeah. So the Wisconsin Woodland Owners Association, or WOA, as we lovingly call them in the forestry world. So private landowners, again, they own the bulk of our forests, and so they are critical to what happens going forward. And so you have organizations that help support them. And the Woodland Owners Association is a good example of an organization that brings together landowners to learn about, exchange information about, understand how they can be stewards of their property. So, and like the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and there's other groups in the state that work with landowners through associations like that and help landowners understand how they can manage their land. The managed forest law. So one of the things I actually thought about and then I decided to take it out was we have interesting, the way in which laws affect how forests, what happens to forests. So you have the push around issues that incentivize agriculture that result in loss of forests. Well, one of the laws passed right after the constitutional amendment was done the second time was the forest crop law, which created a tax differential for individuals, entities that would manage the land for forestry, okay, for longer term. So they couldn't cut and run. Basically, they had to maintain the forest, and the forest condition had to be open for the public use, et cetera. That was then, another law came in the 50s. It's no longer exists, but then in 1985, the managed forest law was passed, targeting more smaller land ownerships, again, recognizing the growth of those number of ownerships. The managed forest law still exists today. It gets amended every few years for better or worse, but the orientation of it is a reduced taxation if you commit to managing your forests sustainably. And, you know, so you have to follow a certain set of restrictions and rules. What that's done is helped reduce the tax burden because we're a high property tax state. And if forest land, when it's taxed at its ad valorem rate, there's an incentive to say, boy, these taxes are expensive. I should carve this up and sell part of it, right? And so without having an incentive for landowners to keep their forests in a good condition, to manage it sustainably, and thereby get a reduced taxes, it creates what I would consider a public win-win of we have more forest land than we probably would have without, I'm sure we would have without it. We've got landowners managing that land under professional guidance so that it's producing values that we all benefit from as society. So that's had been the goal of, and that started, and we were one of the first states in the country to have a law of that foresight back in the 1920s.
I guess my question is very similar to that. With the increased fragmentation, is there like good news in terms of like putting ecosystems and forests together? Putting ecosystems and forests together, like Ice Age Trail getting plots of land together, or like the push to make a national park in Door County,
Mhm.
combining all those public lands.
Yeah, so things like the Ice Age Trail and whatnot, again, if you look at like that, so that's a national trail, 1,100 miles long in Wisconsin. And that the more ownerships it has to cross, the more difficult it is. So again, another reason why it's really helpful to try to keep ownerships, keep land. It just makes it easier to navigate those circumstances. The Ice Age Trail and Park Foundation has done a great job of obtaining long-term leases or easements on land so that we get the benefit of trails like that. The ability of consolidating. So some of the work that we're doing to look at ways in which we can continue to have larger blocks of land are, for example, our Forest Legacy program, where these formerly large blocks that have been divested from, that ideally the public doesn't need to actually manage those properties. They can stay, if they could stay in private ownership, but if the state or the public could acquire the rights to access for the public and assurance that it would be managed sustainably and kept in a collective ownership, that's a win-win. And we have a number of Forest Legacy projects in the state. I can't remember the total acreage now, 200 and some thousand, no more than that now, probably, right? A lot, hundreds of thousands of acres. We've been able to do programs like that in. There's a controversial one right now up, if you've ever heard of the Pelican River, if anybody's been tracking that news, that's an example of a Forest Legacy easement, and it's drawn some controversy. So again, competing interests, different perspectives. Huge amount of forest is about bringing together people and looking at how we can make sure we can sustain those values long term.
Well, first of all, thank you. And your presentation has kind of created a bit of a dilemma in my mind. And part of it is the sustainability and the dynamics within the forest itself and all the interplays that take place in that. And then the timelines in terms of planning and funding to make those things happen. And how do you walk that line?
Carefully. Yeah. That is a challenge. And that's part of what I love about, the forests and forestry is, it does have this set of tensions around. We tend to think in a very narrow or short time horizons. Most of the work we do as humans, we overemphasize shorter term and long. It's harder to do the longer term stuff. And so forestry is one of those things that it has such a long-term component to it, and it's hard. And that's where I particularly admire the work that was done by individuals, but certainly by Wisconsin government over the year of looking way back when, of being, forward thinking in that way about how we do things so that we can look back 50 years hence and say, that was a good, thank goodness they did that, right? So those challenges remain today. And to me, part of it is just how do we bring information to bear to help inform choices? And so part of that's bringing that information that may not be thought of, which is to say, what might this look like in 50 years? How might that inform what choices we make today? Hard to do for sure, but well worthwhile. And again, we've had the advantage of some incredible conservation champions in Wisconsin's history that have resulted in the state we have today, which is in a set of conditions that are producing an incredible array of benefits. So that's on the positive note as well, which is to say, our forests do amazing work for us in this state. And I'm so thankful of all those who came before us, who made choices that have allowed it to do that. And I'm an optimist, and I believe with good information, good choices will be made that our great grandchildren will look and say, thanks for the work you all did as well. So, and every one of us can be part of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.